Imagine reading a geopolitical policy paper, right? And this paper just forcefully condemns an entire nation, like calls it a literal demonic tyranny, a regime that is just so fundamentally corrupted by what it calls a counterfeit theology that it literally cannot possibly be reformed.
Right, a totally irredeemable system.
Exactly. But then you turn the page, and in the very next paragraph, that exact same author demands that the United States military maintain this like incredibly intimate, highly engaged alliance with the exact generals enforcing that tyranny.
It is a massive contradiction.
It really is. And today, we are tearing apart a text that does exactly that. Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are jumping into a profoundly polarizing, dense, and frankly just disorienting document.
Yeah, disorienting is definitely the right word for it.
It's titled Tulsi's Courage.pds, and it is built entirely around one terrifying central premise, which is Pakistan is Iran with nukes.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a premise that completely upends the traditional chessboard of international relations. You know?
Right.
Usually geopolitical analysis relies on, well, a degree of cold pragmatism. You look at state actors pursuing logical security interests or fighting over economic resources.
Like standard statecraft stuff.
Exactly. But the framework constructed in this document, it just throws standard diplomacy out the window. It replaces it with this worldview defined by theological absolutism and structural inevitability.
Which is wild to read. And look, before we get into the actual mechanics of how this author justifies such a monumental claim, we really have to lay down some very clear ground rules for this deep dive.
Yeah, this is crucial.
I want to say this directly to you listening right now. The source material we are unpacking today is intensely politically charged.
Very much so.
It contains religiously absolute sweeping assertions about, Islam, the United States, Israel, Pakistan, and Iran.
Which is exactly why we need to state unequivocally, right off the bat, we are not taking sides here.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing this text, nor are we validating its theological claims or its historical assertions. Our mission today is strictly analytical.
100%. We are here to impartially report on the author's worldview.
Yeah.
We're just like holding this document up to the light to convey the ideas exactly as they are presented in the original text.
Right, to see how the engine works, basically.
Yeah, exactly. The goal is to help you understand the internal mechanical logic of this specific ideological framework. Because look, whether you agree with it or find it completely abhorrent, understanding how these extreme arguments are constructed is just absolutely vital for comprehending the furthest edges of global political discourse today.
It really is. We have to understand the architecture of the argument.
Right.
And to understand how the author justifies that massive contradiction you mentioned at the top, condemning a system while demanding a strategic alliance with it, we really have to start where the author starts.
Which is the mirror image.
Yeah, looking at the structural equivalencies they draw between Iran and Pakistan.
And the text doesn't mince words here. It literally states, quote, Pakistan is Iran with nukes, plain and simple. And the author begins building this case by completely dismissing the idea that either of these nations functions as a democracy. I mean, we see them hold elections, right? The international media covers the polling stations, people are voting.
Sure, there's the aesthetic of democracy.
Right.
Oh.
But under this framework, all of that is purely theatrical.
Yeah, the author argues that true power in both Islamabad and Tehran rests entirely in the hands of a permanent military theocratic class.
Right.
But what makes this analysis distinct is that the author doesn't just define power politically. Like, they aren't just looking at who sits in parliament or who passes the laws.
They're looking at the money.
Exactly. They define it economically. The text draws a direct operational parallel between how these militaries control the actual literal lifeblood of their nations.
So let's unpack the mechanics of that, because the text brings up the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC in Iran.
Right.
It points out that the IRGC doesn't just act as a defense force. It essentially functions as the country's primary economic engine. The claim here is that the IRGC controls roughly 40% of the national economy.
Which is a staggering number.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And they do it through this incredibly opaque network of companies and foundations.
And to understand what that 40% means in practice, we have to look beyond the abstraction. In Iran, the IRGC uses these giant conglomerates like Khatam al-Anbiya to dominate, well, pretty much everything.
Like what? Construction.
Construction, energy, telecommunications, banking, all of it. If you are a citizen wanting to build a major infrastructure project, you are inevitably funneling money directly to the military.
Wow.
And the author holds this reality up as a mirror to Pakistan, arguing that the Pakistani army operates in the exact same way.
Which is where it gets super fascinating, because the text points to the Pakistani military's vast holdings. We're talking about massive conglomerates like the Fauci Foundation.
Right, the military isn't just guarding the borders in this view.
No. They're producing the fertilizer, they're running the banks, they're building real estate developments. I mean, they're manufacturing breakfast cereal. It's this all-encompassing economic dominance.
Yeah, it completely crowds out the private sector. And the author uses this economic mirror image to argue that these are not two different types of governments.
Okay.
They are essentially identical corporate structures masquerading as distinct nation-states.
Oh, that's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, and because the military is the economy, you cannot simply sanction the military without starving the civilian population. The structure inherently protects itself.
I was actually thinking about how to visualize this, and it's like a parasite that has grown so massive and deeply entrenched that it actually acts as the host's skeleton.
That's a great analogy.
Like, you can't just surgically extract the military theocratic complex from the economy without the entire country collapsing into a pile of dust.
Yeah.
That's the level of control the text is asserting.
That is a highly accurate translation of the text's premise, but the author goes even deeper into the operational reality by examining the concept of merit within these systems.
Right. How do you get promoted?
Exactly. If the military controls the economy and the state, how do people rise to the top of that military? I mean, in a standard secular state or a Western democracy, you would naturally expect military leadership to be promoted based on, strategic acumen.
Sure. Battlefield success, logistics management, tangible military skills.
Yeah.
You want the general who knows how to actually win a war and manage a supply chain?
Precisely. But the framework presented here insists that in these military theocratic systems, the metric for success is entirely inverted.
Completely flipped.
Yeah. The author specifically cites General Saeed Munir, Pakistan's army chief. The text highlights that General Munir rose to the absolute pinnacle of power, literally commanding a nuclear-armed military, not because he demonstrated unparalleled brilliance as a military strategist.
Right, then why?
Because, as a child, he memorized the Quran.
That is a staggering operational claim to make.
It really is.
The text is literally arguing that merit, in the eyes of the Pakistani military establishment, is measured by religious recitation and theological adherence rather than technical or tactical genius.
And the author immediately maps this back onto Iran to solidify the mirror image.
Right, tying it all together.
Yeah. The argument is that the supreme leader and the entire clerical apparatus in Tehran rule by that exact same standard. Ideological purity and religious adherence systematically supersedes any sort of technical competence.
Okay, wait, hold on. Flattening the IRGC's 40% economic dominance in Iran into the exact same bucket as Pakistan's military economy feels like.
Well, it feels like a massive historical leap.
How so?
Because Pakistan has an entirely different colonial legacy, right? It has a long history of alignment with the West, completely different legal frameworks. I mean, is the author just completely ignoring all of that historical context just to make a punchy structural point? Well, under the worldview constructed in this document, that historical nuance is basically categorized as irrelevant noise.
Really? Just noise.
Yeah. The author is exclusively focused on the structural end result. Because both systems ultimately resulted in a military clerical elite controlling the economy and dictating advancement through religious purity, the text asserts that their operational reality is identical.
So the journey doesn't matter, just the destination.
Exactly. The different historical paths they took to get there simply do not matter to the author's core thesis.
Okay, if we accept the author's premise that these states are identical engines of theocratic tyranny functioning as these massive military economic monopolies, that brings us right back to the central paradox we started with.
The contradiction.
Right. If they are identical, you would naturally expect the author to demand identical treatment. You would think the argument would be sanction Pakistan, cut them off from the global banking system, and isolate them exactly how the West attempts to isolate Iran.
You'd think so, but this is where the text introduces a severe dose of realpolitik. Despite defining the system as total tyranny, the author explicitly argues that Washington must not isolate Pakistan.
Wait, really?
Yeah, in fact, they advocate for continuous high-level engagement.
Which feels entirely contradictory. Why keep engaging with a military that you've just spent pages comparing to the IRGC?
The author justifies this through the concept of the safety valve.
The safety valve. Okay, explain that.
The text argues that the personal, direct relationships forged at the highest levels between American military commanders and Pakistani generals serve as a critical emergency brake.
Ah,
It's a purely pragmatic calculation born out of the terror of nuclear proliferation.
okay, so it's like keeping a direct phone line to a mob boss.
Yes,
You don't
exactly.
approve of the syndicate.
Mhm.
You know they are running an extortion racket and controlling the local economy, which, by the way, perfectly aligns with how the text views the military's control of banks and real estate.
Hmm.
But when violence is about to spill over into the streets in a catastrophic way, you need a direct line to someone who can actually pick up the phone and force the violence to stop.
That's the exact logic. And the text actually provides a geopolitical parallel to illustrate how this works, bringing in the dynamic between Russia and India.
Oh, that's interesting. How does that fit in?
Well, the author points out that when European leaders see Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi hosting Russian President Vladimir Putin in Delhi, their primary reaction isn't to view it as a betrayal of Western democratic values.
Is not.
No. Instead, the text claims they actually feel a profound measure of relief.
Relief. Relief because they have an active back channel.
Yes, exactly. The underlying logic is that European leaders hope Putin is not so far gone that he would do the unthinkable, and that if the situation in Ukraine or elsewhere deteriorates toward an absolute worst-case scenario, Delhi can be called upon to intervene.
Ah, I see.
Modi acts as a rational buffer who still has the ear of an actor the West views as highly dangerous.
Okay, so the text is applying that exact same logic to the U.S. and Pakistan. The author values these personal military relationships over any semblance of democratic idealism.
Completely.
But I want you, the listener, to put yourself in the shoes of a diplomat for a moment.
Mm.
How do you conceptually balance the moral weight of dealing with a system that your own intelligence describes as an absolute, unyielding tyranny with the practical, terrifying need for that safety valve?
It is a staggering tightrope to walk.
Seriously.
And the author acknowledges the deeply unsavory nature of this alliance, but insists it is an absolute geopolitical necessity to prevent a nuclear catastrophe. However,
There's a however.
oh, a big one. What makes this document so jarring is that right after laying out the cynical, highly pragmatic strategy, the author abruptly abandons standard geopolitics entirely.
Yeah, this is where the landscape of the document shifts dramatically. The author just stops talking about troop movements, economic conglomerates, and diplomatic back channels, and plunges headfirst into what the text calls a deeper civilizational reality.
Right, getting into the underlying causes.
Exactly. If keeping that military phone line open is just pure, cynical pragmatism, the author now wants to explain exactly what is driving the irrationality of the other end of the line. Why is the author so deeply convinced that these systems can never, ever be democratized or reformed?
And to answer that, the author launches into a highly aggressive, deeply polemical theological critique.
And this is heavy stuff.
It is. The framework presented here doesn't just critique the political implementation of Islam. The text actually asserts that the religion itself is the foundational root of the tyranny.
Again, honoring our impartiality rule, we are simply analyzing the claims made in this text to understand its internal logic. And the claims here are absolute and uncompromised.
Yeah, they are.
The text explicitly labels Islam as the anti-religion.
And the author frames this within a literal supernatural battle between good and evil. The document asserts that the devil created Islam as a deliberate counterfeit faith.
A counterfeit faith, that's an intense phrase.
The specific mechanical reasoning the text provides is that the devil first attempted to capture humanity by peddling atheism, but found it insufficient to fulfill human spiritual needs.
So atheism didn't work.
Right. Therefore, he created this counterfeit religion as a secondary trap.
The text even uses an old idiom, saying the devil sold the Brooklyn Bridge, and when that worked, he sold an entire religion.
Yeah.
It goes on to make incredibly stark claims about the fundamental nature of the Islamic concept of God. According to the author, Allah, as described in the Quran, lacks the fundamental attributes of the true God.
Mm-hmm.
The text claims Allah lacks omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence, and crucially, this is a major point for the author, asserts that Allah does not actively enter human history.
And that theological detail is critical to the author's political argument.
How so?
Well, by arguing that the Islamic concept of God is distant and fundamentally disconnected from human history, the author is trying to build a case that the religion offers no mechanism for grace, intervention, or internal reform.
Oh, I get it.
The author contrasts this specifically with a Christian framework, noting that Christians are taught to hate the sin but love the sinner.
Which introduces the idea of redemption.
Exactly. The text deliberately positions the Islamic faith in stark opposition to this idea of grace. It paints it as a system that demands absolute submission without the possibility of redemption, which the author argues inevitably translates into political tyranny.
And the author goes even further by attacking the historical foundations of the faith. The text boldly states there is no verifiable historical Muhammad.
Yeah, that's a huge claim.
It argues that just as runners run and swimmers swim, prophets must prophesy. Yet it claims there are no credible, verifiable prophecies attributed to Muhammad.
And the logical endpoint of its entire theological deconstruction is the author's conclusion about the modern states we are discussing.
Right, bringing it back to Iran and Pakistan.
Exactly. The text asserts that the Islamic Republic of Iran is not a radical perversion of a peaceful religion hijacked by extremists. Rather, the author insists that Iran is simply the Quran taken to its logical, inevitable conclusion. The document literally states that Sharia law is tyranny codified.
Look, I have to pause and push back on the sheer absolutism of the author's logic here, because it feels like it creates a massive structural flaw in their own argument.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right. Because by completely erasing any historical nuance, by dismissing the varying schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the history of Islamic golden ages, and the lived experiences of literally billions of peaceful practitioners, doesn't the author actually sabotage their own geopolitical strategy?
It's a huge contradiction.
Think about it. If the root of these nations is fundamentally, literally demonic, as the text claims, how can earthly safety valves, like the U.S.-Pakistani military back channels, possibly be effective?
You are hitting on the central cognitive dissonance of the entire document.
Thank you. Just doesn't add up.
The worldview constructed here relies on two contradictory pillars. On one hand, the author believes you can maintain a pragmatic operational safety valve with military commanders.
Right.
On the other hand, they argue that the underlying spiritual and societal system is a literal manifestation of the devil and is entirely unreformable.
It makes no sense. You're keeping a direct line to the mob boss, but you're simultaneously arguing that the mob boss is a literal demon who fundamentally cannot be reasoned with.
Exactly.
How do you negotiate with an entity that your own framework defines as supernatural evil?
You don't. And that profound fatalism, the belief that the system is spiritually doomed, bleeds directly into how the author views any internal resistance or attempts at political reform within these countries.
Oh, this part is dark.
Very. Because the author defines the system as a theological tyranny, they hold an incredibly bleak, almost entirely hopeless view of the populations trapped inside it.
So let's look at how the text applies this fatalism to Iran first. We've all seen the news footage over the years. Millions of Iranians, particularly women and young people, risking their lives, pouring into the streets, demanding basic liberties and human rights.
Incredible bravery.
Absolutely. But the text looks at those massive, courageous protests and explicitly calls them pointless.
And the reasoning the text provides for dismissing these protests is chilling, and it relies heavily on the theology we just discussed.
How so?
The author argues that begging the Ayatollah for liberty cannot possibly work because the Ayatollah is not a free political actor making rational policy choices.
Then what is he?
Instead, the text claims he is a literal slave to the devil.
Wow. So under this framework, you can't petition a slave for freedom because they don't hold the keys.
Precisely. And the author then lays out a terrifying historical framework for how the regime mechanically suppresses this dissent. They claim that during the early centuries of the faith, the mandate was become Muslim or die.
Okay.
But the text argues that under the modern Iranian regime, that mandate has evolved into a much more insidious internal mechanism: stay Muslim or die.
Unpack that for us. How does stay Muslim or die translate into the violence we see on the streets of Tehran?
It operates through a horrific legal and theological loophole.
A loophole.
Yeah. The text asserts that when protesters step into the streets to demand secular freedom or human rights, they instantly cross a theological red line. In the eyes of the regime, they cease to be Muslim.
I see where this is going.
Right. And the moment they are designated as apostates, those who have abandoned the faith, they immediately become worthy of death under the regime's interpretation of religious law.
So the state doesn't have to view them as political dissidents who need to be negotiated with or managed.
Exactly.
By labeling them apostates, the system legally and theologically justifies its own lethal violence in a perfect, unyielding loop.
The protest itself is framed as a religious crime punishable by death, not a political grievance.
That's horrifying.
It is. And then the author pivots back to Pakistan to demonstrate how this exact same internal trap operates not just on the streets, but at the absolute highest levels of political power.
Right, they talk about Imran Khan.
Yes, the text points to the tragic arc of Imran Khan, the former prime minister of Pakistan.
Imran Khan is a fascinating case study for the author because he came to power as a populist outsider, right?
Very much so.
He was the cricket star who promised to sweep away corruption, take down the entrenched elites, and fundamentally challenge the establishment.
Yet the author describes Khan as having effectively imprisoned himself within the very system he claimed to challenge.
Imprisoned himself.
Yeah, the text argues that Khan thought he was fighting standard political corruption, completely failing to realize the true nature of the structure he was up against.
And the text is incredibly descriptive here. It says Pakistan is enveloped in layer upon layer of tyranny.
Layer upon layer.
Yeah, it actually lists them out to show how deep the trap goes. You have mafia networks controlling local power. You have the military economic empires we discussed in the beginning dominating national resources. And then you have what the text calls the ISI and intelligence fiefdoms.
We really need to define that term because the author doesn't just mention the ISI, which is Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence Agency, as a standard spy network like, the CIA or MI6.
Right. It's not just spies.
No, the text frames the ISI as a fiefdom. It operates as a literal state within a state. It operates completely outside the jurisdiction of civilian courts, parliamentary oversight, or even the prime minister's office. It has its own economy, its own foreign policy, and its own enforcement mechanisms.
So when Imran Khan or any civilian politician tries to enact reform, they aren't just facing political opposition.
Not at all.
They are running headfirst into a parallel, untouchable, sovereign entity that will just crush them the moment they threaten its interests.
And the author emphasizes this by bringing up Benazir Bhutto.
Oh, right.
She's a figure who is often heralded in Western media as this tragic champion of democracy and progressive reform in Pakistan.
Sure, she's very celebrated.
But the text aggressively subverts that narrative, accusing her of operating in direct collusion with elements of this mafia tyranny just to maintain her own grip on power.
So the argument being that the system is so absolute that even the most celebrated democratic reformers have to make deals with the devil figuratively and, in the author's mind, literally just to survive.
Exactly.
It reminds me of a completely rigged casino. It does not matter if you are a young street protester in Tehran rolling the dice with your very life, or a prime minister like Imran Khan playing at the highest high roller table in Islamabad. You're playing at tables where the military theocratic house always wins.
That's a perfect way to look at it, and that leads to the ultimate bleak conclusion the author draws regarding internal reform.
Which is?
Well, what is the author's solution to this rigged game? The text argues that absolutely none of Pakistan's layers of tyranny, not the ISI fiefdoms, not the military economy, not the local mafias, can be dismantled through democratic elections, anti-corruption campaigns, or economic sanctions.
Why? Because they are structurally immune to standard political tools.
Deeper than that. The text states these structures cannot be dismantled without first breaking what it calls the spiritual bond with the devil.
Which, if we trace the author's logic back to their theological definitions, that literally means the population would have to renounce Islam entirely to achieve freedom.
That is the text's uncompromising stance. The only way to win in the casino is to quite literally burn the entire building down to its foundational ideology. There is no reforming the rules of the game from within.
It is a profoundly tragic, fatalistic framing of the hundreds of millions of people living under these systems.
It really is.
In the author's eyes, anyone trying to fix the system from within or attempting to find a moderate, secular path forward is engaged in a literal fool's errand because the foundation itself is irreversibly corrupt.
So if we step back and look at what the text has built so far, it has established that these nations are structural economic mirrors.
Right.
It has laid out a deeply controversial absolutist theological reason for their tyranny, and it has declared that internal reform is an absolute impossibility. Logically, this worldview can only lead to one final destination.
The external threat.
Exactly.
If the internal system cannot be fixed and is fundamentally demonic, it cannot possibly be contained within its own borders.
Precisely. The text moves from the internal impossibility of reform to the external global threat this uncodified tyranny poses to the rest of the world. The author argues that this system doesn't just desire to oppress its own people, it operates with inherently global, expansionist ambitions.
The text highlights a very specific piece of evidence for this, actually. It looks at the title of the supreme leader in Iran.
Right.
The author points out that the official title isn't just the supreme leader of Iran. The office claims a divine theological authority over the entire earth and all of humanity.
And the author uses the current devastating conflicts in the Middle East to illustrate how this global mandate is put into practice. Well, the text frames Israel as the absolute vanguard. The author claims that Israel is not just fighting a narrow national war for border security or territorial integrity. In this framework, Israel is fighting a proxy war for the whole world.
Because, according to the document, Iran has a publicly stated official, unyielding policy regarding the state of Israel.
Yes.
The text was very specific in detailing this. It says Iran's goal isn't just defeating the Israeli Defense Forces, and it isn't just conquering a specific piece of land. The official policy, driven by that theological mandate, is the complete, literal erasure of the Jewish state from existence.
The author is deliberately painting a picture of an existential, all-or-nothing global war.
No middle ground.
Right. There is no room for a two-state solution or a negotiated peace treaty in a paradigm where one side believes they have a divine mandate to completely erase the other.
Wow.
And to emphasize just how extreme and uncompromising this ideological purity is, the text looks at how the Iranian regime views other Muslim nations.
Yeah, this part of the document was genuinely shocking to read. The text claims that the regime in Iran does not even regard the Muslims living in the United Arab Emirates as true Muslims.
Not true Muslims, right?
It asserts that in the eyes of Tehran, to qualify as a true believer, one must live directly under the political and theological thumb of the Ayatollah.
This specific point is used to highlight the absolute insatiable nature of the tyranny the author is describing. It is a purity test that almost no one on earth can pass.
It's just crazy to think about.
And it perfectly justifies a state of perpetual, unending conflict with the entire outside world.
But, I have to question the mechanical logic here regarding the UAE.
What do you mean?
Well, if the regime views literally all other Muslims outside their direct borders as invalid apostates, does the author believe the regime is isolating itself into an eventual, inevitable collapse? Because historically, you can't fight the entire world forever without your economy or your military just buckling under the weight. Or does the author see this extreme purity test as proof of an impending, unstoppable expansionist raid?
The text leans heavily, almost entirely, toward the latter.
Raid.
Yeah. The author believes this isolation isn't a weakness, it's a terrifying strength. They draw a direct parallel to what they call the early Muslim expansion mindset.
Explain how that works in a modern context.
The author argues that ancient expansions were predicated on spreading absolute terror and conducting raids first, which broke the will of the populace and made actual conquest easy.
Okay.
And the text warns that the modern regime will use economic weapons in the exact same way. They will not hesitate to deprive the entire planet of vital resources, specifically targeting the global supply of oil, gas, and crucial agricultural fertilizers.
And the text explicitly clarifies that this isn't just normal geopolitical economic pressure. It's not a trade war or standard sanctions bargaining.
Right.
The author defines it as a strategy of global terror. They view these economic threats as modern-day raiding tactics designed to spread fear and destabilize the globe before a physical conquest.
Which brings us to the ultimate climax of the document, the most terrifying missing puzzle piece in the author's geopolitical landscape.
Right.
The text states that Iran has the absolute, unyielding ideology. It has the divine mandate for global ambition. It has the economic weapons of mass disruption.
It has all the pieces.
Except one. The only thing it is missing to enact its vision of global erasure is the nuclear bomb.
And suddenly, the title of the entire document drops like an anvil. Pakistan is Iran with nukes.
Exactly. The author frames the global standoff perfectly.
Wow.
Israel faces Iran. India faces Pakistan.
Wow.
The text is screaming at the reader that the world already knows exactly what this radical, unreformable, expansionist system looks like in practice, because we watch it operate in Iran every single day.
But Pakistan already possesses the ultimate weapon.
Right.
The entire document is basically a giant, flashing red warning light directed at Western policymakers. It is saying, you need to understand the theological and structural reality of Pakistan right now, before it is too late.
Because they are already armed.
Exactly, because they are already holding the apocalyptic cards that Iran is desperately trying to acquire.
The chilling implication is that if you understand the internal mechanics of Iran, the IRGC, the suppression of protests, the global ambitions, you understand the exact future trajectory of Pakistan. And if you accept the supernatural absolutism the author believes drives them both, you realize the staggering magnitude of the threat facing the globe.
I want to ask you, the listener, to really sit with the stakes the author is laying out here. If you accept the core premise of this document, if you accept that a massive nuclear-armed state is operating not on standard geopolitical logic, not on a desire for economic prosperity, but with a deeply embedded theological mandate for global erasure, how does that change your entire consumption of the daily news cycle?
It changes everything.
When you see a headline about a new diplomatic treaty or a trade deal or a military summit involving these nations, does it look entirely different through this deeply fatalistic lens?
It forces you to question the efficacy of every single traditional tool of diplomacy. If the underlying motivation of these states is as absolute and unyielding as the author claims, then standard negotiations, sanctions relief, and peace summits are, well, essentially meaningless theater.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and recap this intense, murky journey we've been on through this source material. We started by dissecting the structural, economic mirror images the author sees between the IRGC and the Pakistani military.
Right, the economic monopoly.
Yeah, how conglomerates like the Fauci Foundation act as the skeleton of the state, crowding out the private sector, and how military promotion is based on religious recitation rather than actual merit.
We then navigated the deeply cynical realm of geopolitical safety valves, exploring the author's argument that despite this tyranny, the U.S. must maintain direct military ties with Pakistan's generals.
The mob boss analogy.
Exactly, much like Europe relies on Modi's India as a rational buffer against Putin's Russia.
From there, we plunged into the deep end of the author's polemical theology. We examined their highly controversial, uncompromising claim that Islam is a counterfeit anti-religion, and how the legal loopholes of apostasy render any internal political protests or reform movements completely tragically futile.
And finally, we connected all those structural and theological threads to the ultimate global threat, a regime with divine ambitions of global erasure, utilizing economic terror, and the horrifying realization that Pakistan is, in the author's eyes, this exact terrifying system, already fully armed with nuclear weapons.
And as we wrap up today's deep dive, we really want to offer one final brief reaffirmation. This conversation was an exploration of a specific, highly controversial, intensely absolute text.
Very absolute.
Our goal was to map out its internal logic, to explain the how and the why behind its extreme claims, not to endorse its worldview or validate its theology. We are here to help you unpack the information and understand the arguments shaping the edges of our geopolitical landscape, not to tell you what to believe.
It is entirely about understanding how different actors in the geopolitical sphere construct their narratives and justify their fears. And, I want to leave you with a final concept to mull over, something that builds on the text's own internal logic but really challenges its core paradox. If the author truly deeply believes that this form of tyranny is rooted in an unbreakable, supernatural absolutism, a literal enslavement to the devil that cannot possibly be reformed politically or socially, is it logically possible for pragmatic, diplomatic safety valves like U.S.-Pakistani military ties to ever truly prevent a catastrophe?
Oh, it's a great question.
Or is the author's geopolitical strategy of keeping a phone line open fundamentally, irreparably at odds with their own civilizational worldview? I mean, can a phone call to a general ever stop a theology?
Wow. Can a pragmatic phone call stop an absolute ideology? That is an incredibly heavy question to take with you. Thank you so much for joining us on this complex, challenging intellectual journey today. We covered a lot of intense ground. Keep reading, keep questioning the narratives and the logic behind the geopolitics, and we will see you on the next Deep Dive.